Is chalky soil really the secret to great English wine, or just clever marketing? What makes it so difficult for English wine to break into the North American market? And is it time for a classified system of English wine? In today's episode, you'll hear the stories and tips that answer those questions in our chat with Henry Jeffries, the author of the award-winning book, Vines in a Cold Climate. By the end of our conversation, you'll also discover how Henry became the wine critic for The Lady, a women's magazine, how Henry's skepticism about biodynamics nearly caused a problem with the famous southern French producer Gérard Bertrand, what inspired Henry to write Empire of Booze, the most surprising thing Henry learned while researching the book, Henry's first experience with English wine, the unusual vineyard experience that totally changed Henry's perception of English wine, a quick overview of the English wine industry today, including the main regions, and why it took so long for English winemakers to embrace the champagne model. Do you have a thirst to learn about wine? Do you love stories about wonderfully obsessive people, hauntingly beautiful places, and amusingly awkward social situations? Well, that's the blend here on the Unreserved Wine Talk podcast. I'm your host, Natalie McLean, and each week I share with you unfiltered conversations with celebrities in the wine world, as well as confessions from my own tipsy journey as I write my third book on this subject. I'm so glad you're here. Now pass me that bottle, please, and let's get started. Welcome to episode 334. If you're listening to this episode on the day it's published, April 23rd, it is World Book Day. Yay! So why not celebrate by trying to win one of 3 copies of the award-winning book, Vines in a Cold Climate by today's guest, Henry Jeffries. I also still have 3 copies of Sally Evans' inspiring witty new memoir, Make the Midlife Move, A Practical Guide to Flourishing After 50, and 1 copy of Fiona Morrison's book to give away, The 10 Great Wine Families of Europe. It has gorgeous full-color photos of landscapes, vineyards, and the amazing architecture of these wineries across Europe. It's a beautiful coffee table book. All you have to do is email me and let me know you'd like to win. It doesn't matter where you live. I'll choose 7 winners randomly from those who contact me at natalie@nataliemclean.com. In other bookish news, if you're reading the paperback or ebook or listening to the audiobook of my memoir, Wine Witch on Fire, Rising from the Ashes of Divorce, Defamation, and Drinking Too Much, a national bestseller and one of Amazon's best books of the year, I'd love to hear from you at natalie@nataliemclean.com. I'd be happy to send you beautifully designed, personally signed book plates for the copies you buy or give as gifts. I'll put a link in the show notes to all retailers worldwide at nataliemclean.com/334. The paperback usually arrives within a day or 2 of ordering. The ebook and audiobook are instantly available. Okay, on with the show. Henry Jeffries has written for Good Food, The Guardian, Harper's Wine and Spirit, Spectator, The Critic magazine, and has appeared on radio, TV, and The Rest is History podcast. He is the author of 4 books, including Empire of Booze and Vines in a Cold Climate, which is what we're going to talk about today. And that book was shortlisted for the James Beard Awards and won the Fortnum and Mason Drink Book of the Year. Along with Tom Parker Bowles, he hosts the Intoxicating History podcast. He lives in Faversham, Kent, with his wife and 2 daughters, and he joins us now from his home in Kent. Welcome to the podcast, Henry. So great to have you here with us.
Great to be here.
Okay, so before we dive into your book, tell us how you became a wine critic for a women's magazine, and which magazine was that?
It was a magazine called The Lady, which has kind of visions of sort of P.G. Wodehouse or something like that.
It does.
Yeah, at the time, the editor was a lady called Rachel Johnson, who is the sister of a former Touslehhead Prime Minister of Britain. And I have a friend who is a journalist, and I used to do this blog called Henry's World of Booze. This was sort of quite a long, this was about 15, 16 years ago, in the early days of blogging, where people would just start a WordPress site and just kind of get going. And I kind of thought, I'm going to try and write about wine and but, I didn't really actually know anything about wine, but I thought I'd try and, be sort of funny about it. And this journalist sent it to Rachel Johnson, and she goes, oh, I really like this because it's wine, but it's not really about wine. So she invited me into her office, and this was when the lady had these wonderful offices in Covent Garden in London, and they were very upstairs, downstairs. So the sort of top floor was all the ladies who were the editors and writers, and they were all very grand and had big offices, and they went to sort of Cheltenham Ladies College and stuff. And then downstairs was all the sort of secretaries and postmen and stuff, and they were all like, Cockney geezers and stuff, and sort of like, it was very much like being in a stately home with the sort of, if you can imagine Downton Abbey or something. And then Rachel invited me into her office, and she said, Henry, I'm glad you've come in. Would you like to be our new features editor? And I said, I don't know anything about features. And she goes, I don't know anything about running a magazine. I'm like, yeah, I'm doing it. And then she goes, will you write for us about wine? So I did that for about 5 years. And it was fun. It was just, I didn't really know what I was doing. I didn't really know what I was talking about. But I tried to approach it in a very sort of accessible, slightly kind of offbeat way.
What were some of your offbeat topics that you did for the magazine?
I did something on how to appeal to wine snobs by talking about grapes you hate. So like things like Pinotage, Sauvignon Blanc. A lot of wine writers, especially like Jancis Robinson, are always like, oh, Sauvignon Blanc, it's awful and stuff.
Pea on a gooseberry bush, yes.
Yeah, ways to impress wine writers, that kind of stuff. So
that's great.
It was a very odd gig, but fun to do.
Huh, very good. Now, you have another story where you're talking to American wine pioneer Stuart Moss the week before he died. What was that conversation about?
Yeah, I was very, very lucky because, for those who don't know, Sandy and Stuart Moss were the pioneers of English wine. They were from Chicago, and he made a lot of money in dental equipment, and she was an antiques dealer. And they sort of decided they were going to have a kind of retirement project in England. And they thought they were going to plant a vineyard in Sussex. And before that, people had made wine in England, and people had made quite good wine in England. But no one had thought to take champagne head on and say, the climate's quite similar, the soil's quite similar. We're going to plant the big three varieties. We're going to get French consultants and French equipment and all this kind of stuff. So it was a vineyard called Nightimber, which is still going, and it's now owned by this Dutch billionaire, and it's very, very successful. But they were the first people to be really ambitious. They were the sort of people I wanted to speak to most for the book. And I was chatting with this very strange Frenchman I know called Jerome. And he's the strangest Frenchman because he collects English wine, and he lives very near me. And I met him through the local book festival. And I was sort of chatting with him, just going, I need to get hold of the Mosses. And he goes, oh, I've been corresponding with them for years. I collect old Nightimber. And he had a whole folder of clippings about Nightimber. He had bottles of the very first vintage of Nightimber, and he had their details. So he put me in touch. And the Mosses, they've properly retired, and they moved to Santa Barbara 2002, I think, 2001. And they've been kind of forgotten about. And they were so pleased to be talking about the old days. And they were just, just full of stories. And Stuart told this wonderful story about how someone from the Ministry of Agriculture came to visit them and said, you're insane. This is a good place to grow apples. And Stuart said, we didn't move 5,000 miles to plant apples. So I interviewed them both and and then the week after, I had a message from Sandy saying that he'd died.
Oh.
So it was
how sad.
Incredibly sad. And he was in his mid-80s, but it was quite sudden. So I feel so fortunate enough to have been the last person to interview him and have him tell his side of the story for the book. So that was a real bit of luck and a bit of a sad story as well.
Yeah. When did they plant the vines? When did they start Nightimber?
I think they planted in 1988. They did a very small trial vintage in 91, but the first commercial release was 1992. And I've tried that wine a few times, Blanc de Blanc, kind of more recently disgorged. I think disgorged in the last 5 or 10 years, so bought directly from Nightimber. And it's honestly one of the best sparkling wines I've ever had. They got it right absolutely first time, which is extraordinary when you consider what most people in England were making at the time.
And is Nightimber still today considered one of the best English wines?
No, definitely. They're huge now. I mean, they've got hundreds of acres of vines, something like that. So they produce a very nice non-vintage, which is sort of 35, 40 pounds, which is always very good.
You're talking euros, right? 35, 40?
Pounds.
Oh,
So,
pounds.
so
Okay.
sort of roughly the same in euros. Probably a bit more if you're buying it on the continent. Not that you probably ever find it on the continent.
We don't get much in Canada of English wines, like a few here and there, but not a lot.
The problem with Canada is Canadian wines are quite similar to, especially like Nova Scotia.
It's true.
The style and the sort of the sparkling wines, very, very similar. So there's absolutely no reason why Canadians need English wine. Though actually you do some stuff that's quite different from us as well, but our stuff is quite similar. And then they also do some single vineyard wines and then some sort of prestige ones. And the single vineyard ones, I think, are always some of the best in England. So, yeah, and they age incredibly well. So they're still right in front.
Right. Okay. We will get more into sparkling wine and those wines in a moment, but I still wanted to hear a few more of your stories before we dive in. You almost got into trouble talking with Gérard Bertrand, the winemaker in southern France, Languedoc, because you were skeptical about biodynamics during a press trip.
Yeah, well, I just find biodynamics. It's just so kind of obviously ridiculous.
What do you find ridiculous about it?
Well, the stuff about, like you get a mouse, when Saturn is in the third movement of Venus or something, and then you skin it, burn it when Venus is in the second movement of Saturn, and then you dilute that to homeopathic quantities and then use that to treat mildew or something. It just seems like such obvious rubbish. Obviously, Gérard Bertrand takes it very, very seriously, and he takes it a lot further. So it's not just the kind of burning of the mouse and the cow horns and all this.
I never heard about burning mice. They burn a live mouse?
No, they kill the mouse.
They kill. Okay, just asking.
There's a kind of ritual slaughter of the mouse where you chant. I don't know. I think the mouse is dead. It has to be the right mouse. It has to be like an organic mouse.
A mouse who deserved it.
It can't be a factory mouse, because that wouldn't be
very of the earth or the
not
planet.
in keeping with Steiner's teaching. But if you go to Bertrand's Clos de Temple, which it makes this incredibly expensive rosé, and it has all these like pyramid-shaped fermenters with gold tops, and it looks like something from Star Trek. And I was chatting with the winemaker, and he was going, "Are these fermenters? They channel the forces of the cosmos into the wine." And I was like, "Oh, really? So have you done tests where you compare non-pyramid wines to pyramid wines? So empirically you can show that there's a difference." And he goes, "No, you don't understand. They channel the forces of the cosmos into the wine," like that, like moving his hands to show how the forces of the cosmos got into the wine. And then he looked quite cross. And then the PR lady pulled me aside and was like, "Monsieur Bertrand takes all this stuff very seriously." And I was like, "Oh." Everyone kind of looked at me and sort of like that. And then I was like,
Yeah.
Readers will have to imagine French people looking really kind of skeptical.
Askance, yes.
Askance, yeah. So I just kind of kept my trap shut for the rest of the trip.
I agree that there's a lot of woo-woo about biodynamics. The only point I do see, though, with it, bit of a counterbalance, is that anything that makes you pay attention to the vines and the health of the vines, the health of the land is, I think, worth it, but perhaps just a little bit overdone in that case. All right. So what drew you to this story in particular, vines in a cold climate? I mean, you live there, so perhaps it's just obvious you want to write about what was all around you, but what was the inspiration to actually write the book?
I do live in English wine country, but actually I wasn't very interested in English wine. I'm much more of a kind of, I like wines from the Rhone, I like port, things like that. I like big sort of robust wines. And I was approached by the publisher. They'd read a big article in the Sunday Times, and they said, "Oh, there's something happening in the vineyards of England. We should do a book on it." And there was somebody at the publishers who I kind of knew very vaguely. In fact, I'd actually been for a job interview with her about 20 years before, and she turned me down. But she knew that I was now writing about wine. And she said, "Oh, why don't we try this?" I was going to say young man, but not particularly young. So they approached me, and I was a bit like, I don't know, because English wine seemed from the outside quite corporate. There's a lot of people, sort of ex-bankers and stuff, made a packet in the city, planted some vines. They all have branded gilets and kind of golf umbrellas and stuff. And I thought, there's not much of a story here. But then I kind of started digging down, and I realized that actually I'd kind of got the industry wrong. There's a lot of very big personalities, some real mavericks, and it was a lot richer than I thought it was. So I agreed to do the book, and I started right at the end of 2021, and they wanted it in just over a year.
Wow.
So this was still sort of COVID time. So I spent sort of 6 months traveling around vineyards in my old car, meeting people and stuff, and sort of, trying to get around all the kind of bizarre regulations there were about meeting people. And then I spent about 3 months sitting in my office trying to write the bloody thing, which was really hard because I just had hundreds of hours of interviews, notes and sort of things like that. And trying to shape all that into a 300-page book was an absolute nightmare. And if you find mistakes in the book, there are mistakes in the book because I didn't have enough time to get it quite as good as it could have been. But, I think I did all right.
I think you did all right, too, with the number of awards and recognition you've received for it. So what was the most surprising thing you learned while you were researching and writing the book?
It's a hard question. I mean, I suppose the thing about just sort of how interesting these people are did surprise me, just the sort of personalities. There's a few stories that stand out, like sort of surprising stories. But the kind of overall thing was just how unguarded everybody was. So if you kind of did the same book about champagne, you'd have all the PR people sitting there. All their comments would have been sort of weighted against what their kind of vision 2028 was. But this was just a load of people just who wanted to tell their stories. And some of them were just so unguarded, and some of them were incredibly rude about each other. And a lot of it just didn't go in the book because I just thought, I can't face this. I can't face like problems with libel and stuff. There was one chap from a vineyard called Chapel Down, who are one of the biggest producers in the country. And he was just telling me about how all the investors were sort of, he said, like charlatans and liars. This was in the early days, not the current investors, who were all lovely, of course. And just said that his job was basically dealing with basically crooks, people who were not straightforward, not 100% honest. Just told me all about it. And then I kind of went through it with lawyers, and they go, well, we can't actually name names. So that was it. It was basically, what surprised me was just how unguarded everything.
Unguarded. And you said some had some really particularly memorable stories. What's an example of one of the people that you met?
The same man.
The Chapel Down guy, yeah.
Yeah, Chapel Down. So he's called Owen Elias, and he's done everything. He's worked for sort of every producer, made so many different wines, made some wonderful wines, probably made some terrible wines as well, just seen the kind of highs and the lows. And he told me that one of the growers that they worked with, who was one of the crooks, basically, turned up with all these Sable Blanc, which Sable Blanc is this hybrid grape.
They make it in Nova Scotia.
And it can be wonderful. If you get it right, it actually makes some incredibly good wines. But if you don't get it right, it tastes like, in Owen's words, like cabbage and potatoes. And he had this 7%, fermented it, and he got to 7%. And he was like, what the hell? I mean, can you imagine how acidic that would be? And he goes, what do I do with it? And he was sitting there in a tanker. And then they had a fire. And he goes, and then we had a fire. And that took care of that one. So I go, was it a deliberate fire? And he goes, no, nothing like that. But then he goes, but we did have the most wonderful insurance. So that paid for a new winery.
How convenient.
How convenient, yeah.
Some things just work out, So.
Yeah, exactly.
That's great. What was the most surprising, or one of the most surprising things someone has said about your book since it's been published?
It was just lots of people have said some really nice things. Stephen Skelton was very, very funny. He is Mr. English Wine. So I get emails from him the whole time. He sent me an email today telling me I got something wrong in something I'd written. But he's been making English wine. He's a consultant. He advises people on where to plant. And he said something like, I can't remember the exact words, but it was, it's a good book in a kind of warts and all sort of way, but I hope he's got a good libel lawyer on speed dial, because he doesn't hold back. But that's him being very, very complimentary. Yeah, that was one of the more surprising things someone said.
That's great. All right. So now your book provides a really fascinating journey of the English wine industry. Let's start with your first experience, or one of the first experiences you had drinking English wine. You described it as tasting like boarding school stone floors. That's really specific. What did you mean by that?
I'm revealing too much about my past. It was at a wedding in Suffolk, and the wedding venue made its own wines. And just, I tasted it. I'd never had a wine like it. It was quite sweet, like a sort of cabernet or something. But then it had this acidity that just closes your whole mouth down. So it's not like that lovely Mosul, refreshing, mouth-watering green apple kind of thing. It was like acid. It was like sort of like drinking citric acid, and it just shuts your whole palate down. And it was just so unpleasant. And I thought, this is not a good place to make wine.
Yeah, but later you discovered, that might be helpful for making English wines, assuming perhaps sparkling wines, that level of acidity?
Yeah, maybe not that level of acidity. I mean, that is crazy. And in fact, I was talking to this man who set up the sort of, I can say England's answer to UC Davis, but that's kind of overselling it. But there's a college where you can learn how to make wine called Plumpton, and he set up the course there. And he was talking about the kind of grams per litre of Chardonnay that he harvested when he tried to grow it. And it was something like 300 grams per litre of tartaric acid. And that's about 3 times what you get in Champagne at the moment. So that's a lot of acidity. But you're right, sparkling wine, you do want a lot of acidity because it softens and provides that kind of backbone for aging.
Just not that much.
But not that much. But I think it took a long time for people to move away from the German model. So there were lots of people trying to make German-style wines in England and then make up for the lack of ripeness with Sus Reserve, with grape juice.
Sweetening it, yeah.
You're sweetening it. But it took a long time. It's funny, you read, I've got a lot of old books on English wine, and people kind of talk about similarities to Champagne, the sort of acidity, the kind of foaming and stuff. Even like right back to the 18th century, people were commenting about, because people had tried to make wine before. And so all the time, the Champagne model was clearly the way to go, but it took a long time for the industry to come around to that.
Was it the 2007 Thiel vineyard wine that changed your perception of English wine and what it could be?
Yes, yeah, it was. There's a huge mail order wine company over here called Laithwaite's. The chap who runs it has been selling English wine since the 70s. He's called Tony Laithwaite. He's a very interesting man. And he had this crazy idea. They just built a new warehouse just to the west of London in a town called Thiel, which is near Reading. And there was a load of old rubble. And he goes, this would make a good vineyard. And so whatever Tony got. So they put some soil on it. They spoke to Ridgeview, who were one of the pioneering English producers. They planted some Chardonnay. It was probably about an acre. It was harvested by the people who worked in the offices that were there and then taken to Ridgeview. And it was so good. It was so sort of ripe and kind of bruised apple and, a bit like a sort of Bollinger or something like that.
What's a bruised apple taste like? I've heard that before, but I never understood what people were.
Well, it's like when your apple oxidizes, when it's brown rather than when you first cut it, you get the fresh apple. And then you get that kind of, when it's oxidized slightly, it tastes like kind of darker caramel toffee, that sort of stuff.
Yeah, gotcha.
Almost like a cooked apple. It's almost like you're halfway to making a pie with it. So that's the sort of flavour. Later, I spoke to a woman who was involved with the vineyard. And sadly, when they moved offices, there's now like an Amazon distribution centre there. So the whole vineyard was destroyed. But she told me that they thought that part of the reason why the grapes got so warm was because there was a special microclimate caused by lorries with their engines idling on the nearby motorway. So there was a kind of goutte de camion or something like that. And so terroir comes in very odd guises sometimes.
Yeah, fascinating. So why don't you think the wine world, and maybe it's just us here in North America, why haven't we recognized, it seems, the transformation that's happened in English wine, the jump in quality and so on? Is it just because we don't get enough of the product here, or is there another issue?
I think it's definitely that. I think it's for lots of reasons. Like the quantities are very small. Selling to America is very hard. Selling to Canada is quite complicated as well, I believe. It's not like selling to one country. If you sell to Japan, you can just get some person to import it. Whereas in North America, you have all your kind of complicated systems by state. And so you need somebody on the ground selling it. So there have been times when it has been imported, but I just think it's incredibly hard. And especially as, as we mentioned before, Canada from Nova Scotia makes pretty similar style of sparkling wines. California has some pretty good sparkling wines. And then once they come over to you, the price is pretty much the same as champagne. And so why would you, unless you were, you wanted something quite unusual? So there's all kinds of things that you come up against, which stops it taking off. And I wonder if it ever will. I think it'll probably outside sort of Northern Europe and maybe some other markets. I think it'll probably always be a bit of a curiosity.
So if you could define what English wine is in a sentence, maybe that's impossible, but how would you position it? If you were coming up with a marketing campaign or a slogan, how would you describe English wine?
I mean, marketing is not my strong suit. Like France, but fresher.
Okay, that's good. Hey, there might be a career for you in marketing yet.
Yeah, maybe. The best sparkling wines I think, are as good as sort of equivalent champagnes, but they have this zing, this kind of sort of electricity that's sort of different to champagne. And then you get some kind of still Chardonnays, Pinot Noirs and stuff, which, especially the still Chardonnays, can be absolutely superb, but they're very lively and fresh. So yeah, like France, but fresher.
Okay, good. So you mentioned that England produces a very small amount of wine. That'll change each year, but on average, roughly how much is it producing, like volume or bottles or however you want to frame it?
In a very big vintage, like 2018, 15 million bottles. In a lot more planting. So I think probably in a big vintage like 2023, it might be double that now, maybe 30 million bottles. So if you think, so that's sort of 10 times smaller than champagne.
Okay. All right. Yeah, that's good for perspective. And with that, maybe you can draw us a bit of a mental map where the wine regions are in the country and how they compare in size to Champagne.
My knowledge of how big Champagne is not good. So I'm not sure if I can do that.
That's okay.
So you have London, which is in the southeast corner of the island. And then above it, you have Essex. And Essex, I always think of as the kind of New Jersey of England. It's kind of like very influenced by the city. It's quite rough and ready and stuff. So that's above. That's very good for still wines because it's dry, it's warm, you can leave the grapes out longer. So some very good Chardonnays coming out of there. So that's sort of to the northeast of the city. Southeast of the city is Kent, Sussex, and then sort of going round to the west, Hampshire, below the city. That's sort of prime sparkling wine country. Basically, the further east you go, the drier it is. So you can leave the grapes out longer, you have less disease pressure, you can get better yield. So basically the kind of southeast, which is where like 90% of the wines come from, increasingly good still wines, but still sparkling wine is the main thing. There's quite a lot of chalk, but there's also green sand, which is like sort of gravel. There's clay, and then Essex is all clay. So it's like, there's one consultant who compares it perhaps a bit optimistically to Pomerol, but it's a similar sort of, the soil is quite similar.
Clay. So for the drainage, does it just retain as opposed to limestone lets the water go away, right? Drain off?
It can get quite boggy, but if you have good drainage and a good slope, then it does. And then it holds the heat and then it sort of dries out, but keeps the kind of moisture down below so the roots can get to the moisture. So it's apparently really good for Pinot Noir. I'm not an expert in geology. And then the further west you go, the damper and colder it gets. Or not necessarily colder. You still get plenty of sunshine, but it gets damper and damper. So the disease pressure is harder and harder. So you have vines in Hampshire, Wiltshire, and then going down to Cornwall, which is in the far southwest. And then further north, you have in the Midlands, there's sort of vines. Well, in fact, Wales has some quite nice wines in the southern part. So that's sort of over to the west. And then you go further north and there are vineyards, but they tend to be they would use hybrids and things like that. So if you're after kind of classical wine, you need to go to southwest. There are some as well.
And we always hear about the comparison again to champagne soils, the chalk or the White Cliffs of Dover, the chalkiness, which again, I think is limestone, but just correct me, I'm not a geologist either. But do you think that has an influence or is it overrated, the chalky soils in England?
I think it is. I think you're right. I think it is overrated. I think it was the story that sold. So it was same soil as champagne, same grapes, same techniques, but English. So I think there was like a rush for chalk, and it's kind of, people thought chalk was sexy, and it was it was a good marketing angle, and they thought that it was the best place. But in recent years, people, especially with the rise of Essex, people thought that Essex was just clay. You can't grow good grapes there, it's too sticky. And actually people have realized that you can. So I think what's far more important is aspect, the fact that it's not too high above sea level because then it gets colder, but then not too close to the sea, problems with frost, sunshine, rainfall. I think almost everything else is more important than whether it's chalk or clay. Then once you've got everything else right, then you can argue about that. But there aren't that many places where you get everything right, that actually some people have planted in lots of chalk and it hasn't been quite right because they were just seduced by all that chalk. And actually there's been other problems.
Okay. Do you ever think there'll be someday a classified system of English wine the way we see in France, like the Premier Cru, the Grand Cru, or is it just too small? Or do you hope it doesn't happen because it might get too complicated? I mean, what is your thought on that?
There is now a PDO, a kind of European geographical indication for one county, which is Sussex. But it's really too early for it because they've only been making quality wine there for 30 years or something. So it's if you think what the appellation contrôlée is, ideally, it's codifying hundreds of years of tradition, but we don't have any tradition. So it's kind of silly. And especially as, first of all, a lot of producers buy from different counties. So Nightingale will have vineyards in Kent and Sussex and Hampshire and stuff. So that kind of makes a nonsense of it. And also, there's sort of bits of Sussex that are very much like Kent. So there's no point drawing a line where the old county barrier is. It's like, it'd be like sort of cutting the Medoc in half. It doesn't really make any sense. I think the only place where it makes sense is Essex, because you've got this soil and it's all the same. It's this kind of, I've mentioned it before, and it produces some really, really good and quite distinctive Chardonnay. And I think that if there was anywhere, there's this place called the Crouch Valley, which is this peninsula with water on all sides, and it has an amazing microclimate. It doesn't get frost. It stays very, very dry. It's almost sort of semi-arid. And that's probably the only place where you think that's kind of Grand Cru, that's where it's distinctive. But nowhere else quite like that has been found yet.
And would you compare those Chardonnays to like Chablis in northern Burgundy, but fresher?
Actually, no. I mean, they're not actually that Chablis-esque, funnily enough. I mean, other counties produce quite Chablis-esque ones. They're more sort of, it's quite hard to explain. I think they're more kind of almost like sort of really good Margaret River or something like that.
From Australia.
Yeah, they've got that sort of, the best ones have a sort of weight to them that you just really wouldn't expect. And actually, there's a Jackson family vineyards have just invested quite heavily in Essex. So actually, if anyone is going to take English wine global, it would be them.
Okay, interesting. Well, there you have it. I hope you enjoyed our chat with Henry. Here are my takeaways. Number 1, is chalky soil really the secret to great English wine, or is it just clever marketing? We always hear about the chalk, or the white cliffs of Dover in England. Do you think that has an influence, or is it overrated? Well, Henry does think it's overrated, and it was the story that sold. So it was the same soil as Champagne, same grapes, same techniques, but it was English. There was a rush for the chalk, and people thought chalk was sexy. It was also a good marketing angle, and they thought that it was the best place. But in recent years, with the rise of the region of Essex, where people thought that you can't grow good grapes because it didn't have the chalk, they realized that you can. So he thinks what's far more important is the aspect of the vineyard. The fact that it's not too high above sea level because it gets really cold, and it's not too close to the sea. Problems with frost, sunshine, and rainfall if you don't have the right aspect or orientation, height, etc. of the vineyard. He thinks that almost everything else is more important than whether it's chalk or clay soil. And once you've got everything else right, then we can all argue about that. Number 2, what makes it so difficult for English wine to break into the North American market? Henry observes that selling to Canada and the US is quite complicated. If you sell to Japan, you can get one person to import it, whereas in North America, you have complicated systems by state and province. You really need someone on the ground selling it. Plus, Nova Scotia makes a similar style of sparkling wine. California makes good sparkling wines. And so then once you get English bubblies landed in the market, the price is pretty much the same as champagne. So why would you pay that much unless you are looking for something quite unusual? Number 3, is it time for a classified system of English wine? Henry says that there now is a PDO, or a protected designation of origin, which is a European geographical indication for one county, which is Sussex. But he says it's really far too early for it because they've only been making quality wine for about 30 years. The appellation Contrôlé is ideally, in his opinion, codifying hundreds of years of tradition. Plus, a lot of producers buy from different counties, so Nye Timber will have vineyards in Kent and Essex and Hampshire. So that makes a complete nonsense of a designated origin. Also, there are bits of Sussex that are very much like Kent, so there's no real line between where the county barriers are. It's sort of like cutting Medoc in half, he says. That really doesn't make any sense. The only place where it does make sense is Essex because of its unique soil. In the show notes, you'll find the full transcript to my conversation with Henry, links to his website and books, the video versions of these conversations on Facebook and YouTube Live, and where you can order my book online now, no matter where you live. If you missed episode 170, go back and take a listen. I chat about English sparkling wine, magical blends, and harvest secrets. With Janina Doyle. I'll share a short clip with you now to whet your appetite.
If you've never tried English wine, the best to try would be sparkling. Our sparkling wine is actually the closest thing you're going to find to champagne, and not like it's a mimic. When there has been blind tasting competitions, English wine has very often won. About 70% of wine is sparkling wine. And the varieties grown in England are the 3 champagne varieties: Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, and Pinot Meunier.
What is it that your wine regions share with Champagne?
It's the soils. The Paris Basin, it's free draining. It's typically chalk, limestone, and clay. It gives you that minerality and beautiful acidity. That same soil type is what we have in England, certainly in the southern part of England.
The White Cliffs of Dover? Is that chalk or
It's all
limestone?
chalk.
Okay.
Dover is in Kent, and actually the most wineries, or certainly the top wineries,
You won't want to miss next week when we continue our chilly chat with Henry. If you liked this episode or learned even one thing from it, please email or tell a friend about the podcast this week, especially someone you know who'd be interested in learning more about English wines. It's easy to find the podcast. Just tell them to search for Natalie MacLean Wine on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, their favorite podcast app, or they can listen to the show on my website at nataliemaclean.com/podcast. Email me if you have a sip, tip, question, or if you'd like to win one of 7 copies of the books by Henry, Sally, or Fiona. I'd also love to hear your thoughts on this episode, or if you've read my book or are listening to it. Email me at natalie@nataliemaclean.com. In the show notes, you'll find a link to take a free online food and wine pairing class with me called The 5 Wine and Food Pairing Mistakes That Can Ruin Your Dinner and How to Fix Them Forever at nataliemaclean.com/class. And that's all in the show notes at nataliemaclean.com/334. Thank you for taking the time to join me here. I hope something great is in your glass this week, perhaps a zesty English sparkling wine, perfect for toasting to World Book Day. You don't want to miss one juicy episode of this podcast, especially the secret, full-bodied bonus episodes that I don't announce on social media. So subscribe for free now at nataliemaclean.com/subscribe. Meet me here next week. Cheers.